Alright, so for week 8, we were supposed to pick one of the 3 prongs and complete a Title IX self-audit of an athletic program or a high school or college level athletic program. The Title IX self-audit can be found in Chapter 4, and then we are required to make a 15 to 20-minute video. So to start out with, Title IX is defined as no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education, program, or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Alright, so in this audit, the first step to ensure that your athletic program complies with Title IX is to perform a self-audit or review. The self-audit will take a frank look at the school district's entire athletic program and determine if it accommodates the interests and abilities of the students as a whole, and if specific program components detailed in the Title IX regulations are equal for girls and boys. Alright, so another point I'd like to make is that it is most important for a school's Title IX coordinator and for the athletic director to have a solid grasp on the 2 major areas of the Title IX compliance framework relative to a school's athletic program. The 2 key factors under that are that 1, accommodations of interests and abilities, and the second fact is that other athletic benefits and opportunities. So the lack of adequate sports participation opportunities is perhaps the most common Title IX compliance problem, and certainly the most highly litigated Title IX issue. So in 1979, the policy interpretation and the OCR investigators manual set forth in detail all aspects of the so-called 3-prong test. The 3-prong test is as follows. So first prong is that a school may provide athletic participation opportunities for female students which are substantially proportional to the female percentage of enrollment at the school. The second prong is that a school may demonstrate a history of continuing practice of expanding its sports offerings for women in the very recent past. And 3, a school may show that it is fully effective accommodating the athletics, interests, and abilities of the women in its student body. Alright, so for my audit, I decided to do Columbia College in Columbia, Missouri, where I actually attended college, and that's who I'm going to use for the Title IX audit. So I decided to use the second prong in my audit, which is the history and continuing practice of women's athletic programs expansion. The OCR will consider a variety of factors in making the determination, and the factors are a school history and continuing practice of adding women's teams, a school history and continuing practice of upgrading school club level teams to a varsity status, which would be making them actually eligible to compete in the NCAA or NAIA, or in high school, making them not club teams, actually teams that you would see on the MSHSAA website. And then a school history and continuing practice of affirmatively responding to requests for the addition or upgrading of women's teams. And then a school's history and continuing practice of monitoring and the developing interest of women by conducting surveys or reviewing other indications such as growth of club and intramural sports, community sports programs, and local, state, national trends in women's sports. To touch on the key part of the 3-prong test, that is that only one of the 3-prong tests must be satisfied for the school to be considered in compliance. However, as pointed out in the PDF that we were given in class, I'm using that as a reference where it says that most colleges and high schools you do use the number 1 prong in the 3-prong test just because it is the 50-50, having as many men as women athletes on your school campus or enrolled. But as pointed out, most high schools and colleges, if you do have a football team, that there will be too many men on the football team's roster to meet prong 1. So in that case, the compliance can be met with prong number 2 or 3. So basically, when looking at Columbia College, when I was there was only 3 men's teams and 4 women's teams. The men's teams were basketball, soccer, and was it golf? Yeah, golf. And then the women's teams were the volleyball, softball, volleyball, softball, basketball, and that's it. So there were equal amounts. So what they did when they kept expanding was they added baseball for men. And so when they added baseball, they had to add another one for women's to keep the number of athletes completely equal. And so basically now, because of all the additions of the teams, it is going to be men's sports are going to have 7 and the women's have 8. So the sports teams now are as listed. Men's has baseball, basketball, cross country, golf, lacrosse, soccer, and track. Then the women's do have basketball, bowling, cross country, golf, soccer, volleyball, and track and field. So the only team that the men's sports do not have that the women's do is the bowling. To keep the sports numbers the same, that is why the women's sports would have added bowling. Qualifications. There's athletic, financial assistance, and then there's also treatment. So to touch on those just a little bit, the athletic financial assistance is the second major compliance prong of Title IX, encompasses athletic financial assistance. The only monetary requirement of Title IX deals with the area of scholarships. Scholarships must be allocated in proportion to the number of female and male students participating in intercollegiate athletics. Funding for women's and men's programs does not have to be equal, but a significant disparity in funds does suggest that institutions could be found non-compliant in other program areas. Alright, so then the third one is treatment. So this third compliance prong of Title IX requires equivalence in other athletic benefits and opportunities and includes all other program areas and not previously covered. Title IX does not require that each men's and women's team receive exactly the same services and supplies, but it looks at the entirety of the treatment that men's and women's programs receive as a whole. The equivalence of overall treatment is measured on the basis of 11 criteria. They're listed on my paper, and I'm going to read them to you now, and they're going to provide a brief explanation of the legal standard for each thing that's listed. For each of the treatment items described that I'm going to talk about, you will see what law evaluates and the legal language that should be evident in your documentation and best drives the process towards meeting the standard of law. While I may feel redundant, this should be used often when talking about all 11 of these topics. Alright, so there's locker room, practice, and competitive facilities. There's equipment and supplies, scheduling of games and practice times, publicity, coaching, travel and daily allowance, academic tutoring, provision of medical training facilities and services, provision of housing and dining facilities and services, and then recruitment of student athletes, and then support services finally. Alright, so to talk about all of those, going back to the start, we're going to talk about locker rooms, practice, and competitive facilities. They need to maintain the facilities provided for practice and competitive events, the exclusivity of the use of the facilities, the preparation of the facilities for games and practices, and the availability, exclusivity, and the quality of the locker room, the locker and team rooms. A school is obligated to ensure that the overall benefits and treatments of the female and male programs are comparable. So under Title IX, budgets for men's and women's teams do not have to be equal, but the bottom line is that benefits provided for both of them must be equal. Facilities are one benefit that must be equally provided to the men's and women's programs. So both sports teams should have basically the same facilities to use. Equipment and supplies was number 2. Equipment and supplies is determined in examining the quality, amount, suitability, maintenance, and replacement and availability of equipment and supplies. A school is obligated to ensure that the overall benefits and treatments of the female and male programs are comparable. So basically all of these are going to talk about how men and women's sports teams should be treated equally. So under Title IX, with the equipment and supplies, budgets for men's and women's teams, again, don't have to be equal, but the bottom line is that the benefits provided should be equal. Equipment is one benefit that should definitely be equal for both teams. Unless there is a football team, then you are going to see an abundance of money spent on that program because of the number of men athletes compared to women athletes. So then there's scheduling of games and practice times. A school is obligated to ensure that the overall benefits and treatments of the female and male programs are comparable again. So that means any scheduling, including the scheduling of games and practice times, should be equally provided to men's and women's programs. They should have equal access to primetime game and practice times. The nature of what constitutes as primetime may be different depending on the sport or the season, also the school. But a good example of a compliance issue would be if the men's basketball team played all of its games at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, while the women's always played at 5:30 p.m. So they have equal time shared in the main event spot at that school. So then publicity. It encompasses the availability and quality of sports information personnel, access to other publicity resources for men's and women's programs, the quantity and quality of publications and other promotional devices featuring men's and women's programs should be equal. So under Title IX, the budgets, again, have to be equal for publicity. Specific schools do have an obligation to ensure that both men's and women's programs have equal access to publicity resources. And also that means that in like a school paper or on like the news, everything would be equal. So they would have equal opportunity to be published or talked about in those type of documentations. Then coaching. So coaching examines the equivalence and the availability of qualified full-time and part-time coaches, assistant coaches, graduate assistants, if you're talking college level, and then assignments of coaches with comparable training experience and other professional qualifications. So basically, like I said all the time, everything's going to be equal. They want you to make sure your budget is the same for men's and women's. The coaching services need to be equally provided to the men's and women's programs. So you want to be hiring the exact same qualified people for men's and women's teams is basically what that means. Travel and daily allowance. This is going to be more for colleges versus high schools, whereas high schools will just normally take a school bus to away events, whereas college teams will take a charter bus, planes in some cases, a school-sponsored bus. But this is basically saying that a men's team shouldn't be allowed to fly to a location if a women's team has the same game in the same location and they're forced to drive. It should be equal opportunity for both teams. That's also with hotels, food, any type of services that are provided to the team. It should all be the same. Academic tutoring. Basically, this is going to include the availability of tutoring for men's and women's programs. They want to provide qualified tutors. And then employment conditions of the tutors for the men's and women's programs. That should include compensation, term and length of contracts. Those should be the same for both programs. And it should be equally provided. Then provision of medical training facilities and services. This is going to be like your training room, your ice bath facility, your ice makers, anything like that that would be involved in your training room. Also with insurance of injuries or what coverage does that school allow. So if we're talking high school, again, there's going to be no medical coverage through your school. If you're talking college, of course, you're going to be on scholarship most likely, and then there is medical insurance provided by your school. But if it is provided, it should be equal for men's and women's programs. Then provision of housing and dining facilities and services. It's basically saying that men's teams should not get any special privilege when it comes to new housing facilities, housing apartments. Again, this would be more for college than high school. But basically saying that the provision of housing and dining facilities and services, not one should be more beneficial to one of the sexes. Recruitment of student athletes refers to whether the coach or athlete personnel serving female and male athletes is provided with substantially equal opportunities to recruit, whether financial and other resources made available for recruitment meet the needs of men's and women's programs, and whether the differences in benefits, opportunities, and treatment of prospective men and women's athletes affect their recruitment. So basically, if we're offering a male student a scholarship, it shouldn't be any more money than what we could offer a female for a scholarship. A coach does, however, have the liberty to depend on how much he wants to offer, but their scholarship funding should be the same amount as what they have to offer any possible recruit for that upcoming year. Their scholarship fund should be the same amount. And finally, supportive services. This is going to include like administrative services, secretarial services, clerical assistance. Any of those, they should be provided to both the men's and women's sports teams. The school is obligated to ensure that this overall benefits are the same. So student support services should be provided to both teams. So underneath all of those topics from Columbia College, when I was there, everything was equal. There were no differences in scholarship opportunities between the men's and women's, which means they would meet all the Title IX qualifications. However, I currently don't go there anymore. I do keep in touch with all the coaches and everything like that. Speaking to them recently about this project that we were supposed to be doing, I spoke to the volleyball coach, and she was showing me the numbers, and everything was still right on track with being equal and meeting that Title IX qualifications. So as far as an audit on Columbia College's sports teams, they're well on track to actually becoming a Division II school, which is great for Columbia College. But if they want to do that, they do have to increase the number of sports teams on campus. They also do have to increase the number of actual students that go to the school. So hopefully they get that done, but hopefully if they do go to a Division school or Division II school, they will add more men's and women's teams equally to expand their popularity. So that was my audit of Columbia College, and that concludes this project.